Happy New Year, and thanks a lot for accepting our paper. So this is co-author research with Ian Gottlieb from Stanford University, and what we're trying to do is what you see in the title, which is pretty challenging, formulating a theory, a cognitive theory of depression that might help us explain how depression influences political attitudes. And I don't need to convince you, this conference at least, that depression is important for politics and for people's perceptions about politics and the way they think about politics and the way they engage in politics. So I'll skip this and go straight to the point. This is the model we're working with. And so what we know so far is something about this relationship. And it's mostly negative, and so far we tested this in previous research on political efficacy and political interest, attitudes to change in referendums, and evaluations of political objects mostly. What we're trying to do here is to see what are the mechanisms uh, that might help us explain why depression has mostly a negative impact on political attitudes. And so we are building on cognitive theories of depression, and many cognitive theories of depression start with a stress hypothesis. So the idea here is that in someone's life, there are some precipitating stressors, some negative life events, perhaps, or some other environmental factors that might trigger the onset of depression. Of course, it goes on and on in the sense that, according to some of these theories, uh, depressive people vulnerable to depression and depressed people in general tend to have dysfunctional schemas. And so what these stressors do is to activate these schemas and initiating essentially a vicious cycle of negative automatic thoughts and processing biases and of course the depressed mood. And so what this cognitive research on cognitive aspects of depression tell us is that so depression is associated with cognitive biases. So there's a broader sense of negativity bias, and that's been found in specific domains like self-referential processing or interpretation of information or attention to stimuli or memory. So in general, I cannot spend a lot of time on this, but I hope you trust me uh, that there is wide evidence of a negativity bias in depressed people in all these domains. Now, the other point is that depression is also associated with emotion regulation strategies. So people with depression uh, try to find maladaptive or adaptive ways of coping with the depression. And rumination is definitely a maladaptive one and probably the most studied one. And so the basic idea here is that rumination involves repetitive and passive thinking of symptoms of distress and on the possible causes and consequences of depression. And so it consumes cognitive resources and fixates attention on depressive symptoms, and but also leads depressed people to think more negatively about their past, their present, and the future. And so depressed people find it difficult to inhibit the processing of negative stimuli and expel them from working memory. So we have basically these two mechanisms here. So one is negativity bias that might then lead to more negative views about politics and so on. And another one is basically rumination as crowding out thinking about politics. And so perhaps rumination might be more related to those political attitudes related to the self, like political interest or internal political efficacy, perhaps. And but in general, cognitive biases and negativity bias might impinge on those attitudes related to the political system. And so this is very briefly the simplified framework we're working with. We have conducted a survey in the summer. This belongs actually to another project on the impact of COVID-19 on mental health. So not only depression, and ultimately on political attitudes. And but the data are actually very useful for testing some of these ideas. You can see here about the details about the online survey that we conducted. And so very briefly, the variables that we're using. So we have in depressive symptoms is a short form, widely studied, widely used um, for measuring depression in the general population. And this is actually how it looks like, and it's actually much worse than 5 years ago, almost a double in the mean value. So meaning that probably the pandemic is doing a good job in deteriorating people's mental health, not surprisingly. And so for stressors, we're using two sets of questions related to COVID-19. So some questions are about worries and some questions are about stresses. You can see here that the questions they were using for to measure worries about the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's about financial situation, is about also being afraid that someone obviously will feel unwell or die, and so on. And for stresses, we we put questions on some of the normal things that we are experiencing in the pandemic. So wearing a mask, or restrictions on living home, or reduction in social contacts. And to measure the two mechanisms, we're using brooding, which is a very good measure for rumination, and it actually measures the automatic rumination. And so these are the five questions that of the brooding scale. We don't have, unfortunately, in the survey a scale for an inventory for negativity bias, and so what we're doing is instead to rely on some of my previous research showing that depressed people evaluate politics more negatively. And so we're basically asking a similar question in the survey, with the idea that if depressed people have a negativity bias, then they would be more likely to reply more negatively to this question, and which in turn might uh, might influence negatively political attitudes, especially those ones related to the political system. And for political attitudes, we're using internal and external political efficacy. You can see here the questions. These are the two sets of questions that are normally used. And we also have a question about trust in government, and one on political interest. So we're doing two things in the empirical analysis. We have four sets of structural equation models where we test each of these steps that you can see. So the figure only shows the significant paths. So we're testing the step from stressors to depression, from depression to the two mechanisms, and from the two mechanisms to the four political attitudes. And of course also other direct links. But what you see here is what's significant in the models, controlling for sex, age, education, marital status, social grade, whether you're British or not, the region you belong to, and also turnout and party choice in 2019 elections. So you can see here very briefly that indeed stressors are associated with depressive symptoms, and that in turn depression is positively associated with brooding as expected, and negatively associated with government evaluation. But everything seems to be going through government evaluation here, and nothing from through brooding. And so the second part of the analysis what we're trying to do is to do the following. So if depression and our, in this case, our government evaluation mechanism both mediate the relationship between stressors and political attitudes, we should find that well, that depression and government evaluation are significant mediators. And so what we're doing here is to estimate a set of mediation analysis, some mediation analysis with depression as the mediator, and others with evaluation as the mediator. Now, long story short, only for external political efficacy and trust in government, we're finding that COVID worries, we're finding that both depression and evaluation mediate the relationship between COVID worries and these political attitudes. This is not happening in the same way for those political attitudes related to the self. And so, to conclude, uh, what we're finding so far is that depression influences political attitudes, but mostly those ones related to the political system rather than the self. And this goes through this uh, broader sense of negativity bias. I say broader sense because we're also facing a kind of a big endogeneity problem here, because when replacing evaluation of government performance with any of those political attitudes related to the political system, so external political efficacy or trust, we're finding similar results. So there's something that we have to be careful about. Now, the second point here is that COVID worry and stress negatively affect depression. And that's also important because it contributes to research on the impact of the pandemic on mental health. And then we're finding not much evidence actually that COVID-19 factors influence directly political attitudes. This seems to be the case for internal political efficacy, but also for government evaluation on the pandemic. And of course, as a conclusion, well, this is a cross-sectional survey. So although we have a stronger theoretical framework from cognitive theories of depression, we have a strong path analysis there with many controls and so on. Obviously, there's not much that we can do in terms of causal claims. So this is where we are so far, and thanks a lot for your attention. And I look forward to discussing the paper with you. Thanks.